What's going on, folks? This is Eddie Carson. You can call me Brother Carson, whatever works for you. I'm just kind of that soulful person here bringing that funk to us today. You are listening to Race Matters. And Race Matters here is on WJOPLP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3. And today we're going to delve into the avenue of talking about Brother King. And as we delve into that avenue of talking about Brother King, as we get ready to celebrate him, as we celebrate him today, as we celebrate him every January, well, I just want to talk about King in ways that I think it's so interesting. You know, I got to tell you, when I was growing up, and I've shared this story with folks before, I was not much of a Martin Luther King fan at all. And shame on me, and I own that. It took me a while to get there. I want to say, definitely not high school, probably not college. Maybe when I started really delving into some of my research and my writing, particularly when it came to black radicalism, ideology, the American Communist Party and socialism and social progress, I started really thinking about King and reading on him a little bit more. And now that I've read a lot more, you know, I've decided to move from the sanitize aspect of King, which we tend to do every single January, which is a problem for me. So it took me a while, and I think it's important that we think about this brother in different ways. What I'd like for us to talk about in this show today, and what I would like to talk to you about, is what is radical love and who was the radical king? And I want to bring some stuff to you because oftentimes these are the things that folks don't talk about whatsoever. People want to talk about, I have a dream. The brother had a dream. But most folks really have misinterpreted, misunderstood that I have a dream speech. The fact that he has a dream that America might one day actually get to the level they promised so many black folks, but yet the United States had failed to deliver on that. And so I'll delve into that a little bit more. You know, I always talk to folks about this notion of radical love. And those who believe me, those who know me, know that I'm a deep fan of radical love. You know, radical love really sits at the center of a radical brother named Dr. Martin Luther King, and he vehemently believed in radical love. A man who has become sanitized, as we know, since his death in 1968. A man often forgotten for being a radical, and how he loved. And the brother did love. Until one day each year, right, during the month of January, people get together, they take a day off, and they deodorize Brother Martin. They misappropriate his messages. They tune in to social media and start posting a bunch of memes with all of his fancy quotes up on those memes. They essentially turn him into nothing more than a pulpit commentator. Yes, and I'm talking about white folks who tend to do that, but not just white folks, all folks who've not really come to understand what Radical King was all about. So I'm here today to offer just a little bit of truth to what made this brother a radical. And part of that radicalness is in how he loved. You know, King was a radical. And while he was just not some mere pulpit commentator or some line in the textbook, it seems that we have to remind folks about who he is. And let me remind you that when he went to the mountaintop on the eve of his death in 1968, 72% of white people and 55% of black folks did not approve of his radical message. Think about that for a second as we celebrate this brother. 72% of whites and 55% of blacks didn't approve. A lot of that has to do with the fact that his message was condemning militarism in Vietnam. Oh, how unpatriotic of him to do that. A lot of it had to do with the fact that he was calling out the problems of capitalism and how capitalism exploited the souls of working class folks, this corporate element in which American bureaucracy kind of, you know, persisted and existed and lived in. It became part of the narrative. This commercialized culture, people becoming all tuned in and captured into hip hop pop culture, you know, all kind of married into the funk, into the soul, into all of these things, into the material goods, living and existing this particular life because it makes them feel okay. And yet today we still see folks who do that all the time too. But yet when they stop feeling that way, they're going to go to social media. They're going to have conversation. They're going to roll off some quote by Brother King, and they're going to talk about what a great person he is or what a great person he was, recognizing the fact that a lot of people back then didn't approve of him. And I would say, and I'm going to say this, the vast majority of people today here in the 21st century know little to nothing about King. They know little to nothing about King. We talk about people today, and if that brother existed, people would be saying we shouldn't teach him in schools because he's part of the radical left. He's probably a communist. He believes in critical race theory. He wants to talk about race and the problems with America when we're perfect and we've moved beyond racism. People would condemn him the way they continue to condemn elements of race in conversations and topics about race today. King would not be popular today, people. And I'm going to say a vast majority, or not a vast majority, that's a gross generalization, but a lot of people would not care for him today. They would not care for him today. You know, I'm here because like King, I believe in radical love, and I believe in the radicalness of blackness. I believe in the radicalness of progress. But my job's not to be popular. I don't care about being popular. I don't want to be popular. If I'm popular, then I'm doing something wrong. I want to be radical. And part of my radicalness is telling white folks, telling black folks, telling brown folks, telling Asian folks, telling queer and straight folks that you need to get on the bus and figure things out when it comes to the progress that we need to make. And that has to be in solidarity. And it can't be in all fun and game and things that make us feel good. Oh, I'm progressive. I got a Black Lives Matter sign outside. I quote King. Look at me. I'm going to say all this stuff on Instagram or on Snapchat or on, I don't know, what's the other one? Facebook, for example, because that makes me hip. Folks, come on. Stop performing and show up. Show up. And that's what Brother King would say. The major intellectual and practical challenges to Brother Martin's radical love came from his critique of society. Radical love was a moral and practical method for him. And it should be for all of us too, especially today as we really think about King and his legacy. It is why we congregate on days like today, as we should do and as we do each day, but this can't be something about checking off of a box or checking a box and just saying we did that. I remember back in 2018, I joined a group of scholars and activists to mark the 50th anniversary of not only Martin Luther King's April 4th assassination in 1968, but also the massive uprising and protests, things that really sparked the challenges of white supremacy and illustrated the divisiveness that exists. And people talk about King's legacy today. You're going to hear politicians, particularly white politicians, talk about we need to continue to talk across the aisles. You'll have Biden who will talk about let's engage in these dialogues. How do we have conversations? The reality, folks, is those conversations are not going to happen. The right and right-wingers have really come to a particular position of polarization, and polarization is a fact. The Democrats are going to try to pass voting rights legislation, and I'm just going to say it for what it is. You're going to see a number of Republicans who are going to push back on that, and they're going to start dropping King's name and saying, but King didn't want this particular message. The brother died working for the plight of black folks and voting rights. And that's the thing that we need to happen. And that was part of his radical message. And that was also part of the failure of the civil rights movement. Some people contend that it didn't go far enough. And we're starting to see that in many ways. You know, when King was assassinated on April 4th, his slaying proved to be a catalyst for a number of insurgencies, including the organization of black labor into the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in May of that year, and a Black Power salute that I think many of you know about, when we saw Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the Olympics that year throwing up their fist with a black power symbol and a glove on their hand, illustrating the fact that racism has not gone far enough. By the time they did that in the Olympics, King was dead, and they're still evaluating and asking a question: what kind of progress has come to fruition? It was also a flashpoint in time if we're thinking about the 1960s. And everyone wants to talk about the 1960s. Students ask me about it. I hear folks all the time. They want to get into, the age. It's cool on this stuff. And yet the 60s was about black struggle. It was about the black freedom struggle. And yet, even through that struggle, we continue to see it persist here in the 21st century. We know, of course, that the student movements on campuses, among other things, are going to really demand the creation of black studies. Think about it. People today are pushing back against black studies. Well, why are we talking about identity and ethnic study courses? We don't need those things. We just want to continue to talk about the same type of narrative that define a white country as it is. The repression of King and other black activists galvanized students to demand that let's evaluate what we're teaching and what teachers are teaching, what we're delving into a little bit more. Most people, for example, most people are familiar with King's iconic speech, as I mentioned earlier, "I Have a Dream," and that took place on August 28th, 1963. Most people have also been bombarded with the warm platitudes that have emanated from the abstraction of his ideas therein. Many folks have offered that King dreamed of a post-racial, neoliberal, multicultural society in which race ceased to be a topic of discussion, and more importantly, a source of disruption and discontent. People believe that King wanted to be colorblind. Falsity. Not true. There's no such thing as colorblind. When I walk into a room, the first thing people notice, of course, is the fact that I'm a black man. Most people who believe in this mythology ignore his lament that, I quote, "The Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity," but celebrate his dream that little black boys and black girls will be able to join hand in hand with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers, right? That's what we do. Simply put, folks, many are invested in the distortion of King's lofty dream into a commodified fantasy. And that's what's happened, this disruption. King has become a commodified transactional figure that make people feel good about their so-called social progress, particularly white liberals. White liberals love this stuff. Conservatives, they know what they're doing. As early as 1964, King was aware that the civil rights movement was an incomplete insurgency. He knew that it was incomplete and that its bourgeois liberal specifications had not improved the plight for, I would say, the overwhelming majority of black people, especially those who are warehoused and contained in urban enclaves, living in American ghettos, whether it's Chicago or my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, right? People want to believe that this progress was happening. For white liberals in the 60s, it made them feel really good, but yet they got to a particular point where, it was enough, but not so much to make it as radical as Brother King really envisioned. On November the 14th of that year, King addressed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and in doing so, he was enjoining what many call the golden age of the civil rights movement. This golden age did not accomplish everything, and we know that. These legislative and judicial victories did very little to improve the plight of black folks, particularly those in the North. Things didn't get better. I've often contended that the civil rights movement of the 1960s was incomplete, and a lot of people are going to disagree with me on this, but I'm going to say that it failed. And part of the reason why it failed is the fact that we're still engaging in conversations today that are incomplete now because they were incomplete then, and yet we're in a position where we've not been able to move forward in the ways that we want. The changes that came about during this period were at best, I don't know, surface level, very just touching the very tip of the iceberg. There were not really any kind of substantial changes that needed to happen. I'm talking about structural changes, folks. I'm not talking about, this or that, or, now black people can sit at counters and all that. That stuff's good, don't get me wrong. But I'm talking about structural, institutional changes that allow black people to feel like they've been fully and wholly integrated into society. Like the multitudes of earlier black progressives who shaped the tradition of radical blackness, Brother King acknowledged the centrality of racialized economic justice to getting free. The tradition of radical blackness, for example, as opposed to Cedric Robinson's black radical tradition. And if y'all don't know about Cedric Robinson, that brother's just unbelievable, particularly his work on racial capitalism. Underscores the centrality of political, economic, structural, and material critiques of racialized forms of disposition. Now, we think about such disposition in a way that really formulates our understanding of, well, brother, what is the struggle? What is going on? I think it goes back to the tradition of blackness, right? Going back to the 60s, because the tradition of radical blackness can be understood as the internationalist and a leftist articulation against, right? Check this out. Against things that King preached and talked about. Colonialism, right? He was an anti-colonialist. Thinking about what was happening in the 60s with all the uprisings in Africa. Because see, now we're seeing that Brother King was not just someone who gave a great speech and spoke in the U.S., but he was an international symbol as he spoke against colonialism. He was an anti-capitalist. He had problems with capitalism. Now, he wasn't in the Communist Party as the FBI tried to claim as they went after folks who were communists, and I'll get to that in a little bit. He was an anti-racist. He was against militarism and war. He was an anti-imperialist. All of these things, he was that because he aimed to dismantle the structures of domination that sustain racialized states. And those states, of course, exploited the souls of black folks. Its preeminent objective is to imagine, and I want us to imagine this, imagine and brought into this liberal possibility for all oppressed people, right? Imagine that. It reveals the temporal and the spatial linkages among African descendants, wherever they are. Additionally, and that's part of also when we say wherever they are, part of that African diaspora, black people all around the world. Hence, one of the reasons why I identify as a black man, but not as an African American, right? Really thinking about that diaspora that's in place and everything too. Statist authorities have, in various ways targeted progressive people and this praxis norms for them being communists or socialists or calling them extremists or authoritarianists or terrorists. Such attacks have been used to rationalize the use of force, violence, and exclusion, particularly against people of color and our white allies. And those same things were used against King. Just the difference, of course, between King and some other black radicals is the fact that he did believe in nonviolence. And we've got to remember, too, King had to get there when we're talking about nonviolence. It took this radical gay black brother named Bayard Rustin to move King to a position of nonviolence. King really wasn't there at first. King was not immune to the violence of the U.S. state. That's something we got to keep in mind. So, for example here, now the FBI had this file that contained thousands and thousands of pages of documents to reveal extensive wiretapping on King's phone, bugging of his home and his hotel rooms, arrest on trumped up charges, things they made up just to arrest him, to intimidate, to silence him. Because, see, the FBI was in bed with white supremacy. J. Edgar Hoover was a Klan leader in many ways. He wasn't in a Klan, but yet he's orchestrating this semblance of white supremacy because he needs to silence people like Brother King. You know, but the scrutiny and surveillance against black activists who want social progress didn't just fall to Brother King. Many of you who listen to this show know me as an expert, as an author on W.E.B. Du Bois and his radicalness. And so when we think about other black radicals who were subjected to this form of extreme repression, I would say W.E.B. Du Bois, his wife, his second wife, Shirley Graham. Oh, Paul Robeson is another big one. And no one can forget about William Patterson and Claudia Jones. Those are people you should explore because these, again, are black radicals, a part of that black radical tradition who wanted to bring the type of progress needed that we talk about on days like today, on MLK Day. But no one's going to talk about this stuff. Let's just go back to, he's a great man who gave a speech and racism ended, right? Can you see that I'm being a little cynical here? There's a reason why I'm cynical. Because for me, after a period of time, it gets old. This performative nature of celebrating King, this sense of white liberalism and putting up signs and quotes on social media everywhere. Oh, I want people to know how progressive I am. If you're progressive, you're gonna give me a call and you're gonna organize with me. You're gonna do the real heavy, hard work that needs to happen. That's what's going to happen if you're really progressive. But if you feel good about yourself and you just want to enjoy a day like today, have at it. Nothing wrong with that. Just not my cup of tea, right? Because when we talk about radicalism and putting words into action, I think about the three major tenets of King's political thought that really put him squarely in the middle of the tradition of radical blackness, folks, right? His critique of liberalism, his understanding of black revolution in the United States as a part of the world revolution. And we mentioned what was happening in Africa. The revolutions even that are happening in Asia with Vietnam during this time too. You know, we think about his surgical critique of racism, war, and economic exploitations throughout. But yet, I bring you back to one of my favorite documents. A document that a lot of people have not read, because people in schools don't even teach this document. Folks don't know about it, and so they haven't been challenged to do it. And that is his 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. And in his letter, King expressed his disappointment with white liberals. He asserted that in many ways it was the greatest stumbling block in the journey for black equality, insofar as it preferred order in the absence of tension to real justice for black people, right? That white complacency and comfort level. King had little time for those who constantly said, you know what, brother, I agree with you on the goal you seek. We're on the same page here. Absolutely. You know, I agree with everything you just said. I just don't agree with your methods. Your methodology is the problem here. How many times have we heard that? Brother Carson, you're absolutely right. I agree with you. I just don't like the way you say it. Can you say it in a way that just doesn't make me feel so bad? Can you say it in a way that, we can just engage in this little dialogue? Can you just say it in a way where you're just going to meet me where I am? I just need a little bit more time. Liberalism, right there. And that was one of the things that really frustrated King. In 1967, Brother King lamented in his essay, Why We Can't Wait, that white Americans chose to believe that U.S. society has a level playing field that allowed all people, all races, to reach middle-class status and to reach a place of racial harmony. Right? This colorblind argument. Such belief, of course, King asserted, was a pipe dream. It's a fantasy. It was deception. It was designed for comfort and vanity more than anything else. Folks who are too young to remember the Cold War, and I was quite young during the Cold War too, so I'll be honest. More of my knowledge of the Cold War is just living in books and reading and everything. But when we think about what I would call, and what scholars call, the Black Cold War liberalism, it was one of those things that was it was just as pernicious as white liberalism. This conjuncture of what historian Gerald Horne calls the Red Scare. And check this out, right? We know about the Red Scare, being afraid of communists, but also a term a lot of people don't talk about, which is the Black Scare. And the Black Scare calls black leaders in many ways to even turn away from radical activism. So you even got black leaders who are saying, oh, Bayard Rustin, that brother, that gay brother who brought King to nonviolence resistance was just too radical for us. There's a reason why, folks, that King, as radical as he was the face and the spokesperson on the March on Washington. But yet the mastermind behind the whole thing was Bayard Rustin. But we can't have some gay brother who was there. We can't have someone who can be construed as a communist. That can't happen. Indeed, this notion seized upon the opportunity to improve the conditions in keeping with the demands that are consistent with the teaching and understanding of Cold War methods. This emphasis on symbolic racial progress, right? Because that's what King Day is about every year, is a symbol of racial progress. This is element of promoting this notion on the international stage that look at the United States. We are fully a post-racial society, and we've moved in a different direction. That's what we are. And yet when we think about that, the reality, of course, is it's a falsity. It's not true. On April 4th, let's talk about April 4th. And this is April 4th, 1967, because we know what happens on April 4th the next year in 1968. King gave this speech entitled Beyond Vietnam. In it, he enunciated the struggles for black freedom as part of the global struggle to build a new society oriented around peace, prosperity, and people over profit. The Communist Party USA's mantra, their motto is people and planet over profit. So you can kind of see how this radicalness aligns in many ways. King was convinced that if we are to get on to the right side of the world revolution, right? If we, the United States, folks, if we're to get on to the right side of the revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical transformation. We must rapidly begin the shift from a materialist, this thing-oriented society, and that's what we exist in, to a person, to people-oriented society. Going back to radical love. How do we engage in radical love in a particular way? Those are the things that we have to do. Those are the things that are important. I think back to the black communist leader, Harry Haywood, and many folks may not know about Harry Haywood. In 1933, he insisted on the present epoch, this period of imperialism, and how the proletarian revolution of the Negro was what was going to eventually define the colonial problem here in the United States, because the U.S. was an imperialist country. And a lot of people struggle with this kind of language, folks. Whoa, Eddie, I thought we were talking about Brother King and radical love, and you're talking about colonialism and radicalism, because it's all in the same narrative. This is the real funk, people. This isn't the kind of stuff where we put fancy memes up. We're talking about the hard stuff of what Brother King and his revolution stood for and the mission that was there, right? We go back to the fact that 72% of whites and 55% of blacks disapproved of him on the eve of his death. A lot of that, again, comes back to the radicalness of the war question. And many of us know about this with Vietnam. His speech, and I suspect many of you are familiar with it, Beyond Vietnam, King offered, this thought on war, on racism, and on capitalism, and how capitalism exploits people. King once noted something like, a nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify, I love that, will thingify them, as in thingify black people. We just point to it, but there's no real progress that's happening there. Therefore, they will exploit them. And poor people generally, economically, and therefore, because that's what it means to exist in a capitalist society. A nation that will exploit all of us for the goods of the things that need to happen. You know, Martin Luther King, he did not only have a dream, folks. You know, he had this vision of a deep yearning for the comprehensive transformation of America. That is what today is about. A transformation of America, not speeches and social media quotes, not good old white liberalism and feeling good about my progress and how I am, but it is thinking about our communities and what can we do to transform structural systems that disadvantage people. That is the hard work. That is the work that people would call, or that King would call on for folks to delve into. You know, let's think about this. You know, such a society or our communities, whatever you want to think about it, would be devoid of racialized inequality. Racialized inequality exists in Newburyport. Shoot, that's for black and white folks. I mean, how many folks can afford to live there? But how many folks of color live in Newburyport? I don't see banks and folks bending over backwards and companies, you know, killing themselves to hire folks and to do whatever they can to provide housing for them. Right? That's that structuralized element when we think about racialized inequality, narrow nationalism rooted in militarism that exists, this over sense of patriotism that manifests in this false nationalist spirit here in the United States. And of course, the elements of black suffering that persists. You know, this vision orients King toward the tradition of radical blackness. Despite attempts by the ruling class to sanitize his legacy, there are people like me, there are other people out there who are continuing to tell the true narrative of King. And that true narrative of King was the narrative of being a black radical, of black social progress. Folks, I hope you enjoyed today. I hope you will really contemplate and think about this brother. But as you do so, I hope you do it in a way in which you stop and you pause and you do a couple practical things. So here's just a few practical things just to think about. Take out a sheet of paper, right? Take out a sheet of paper and create a list of the things that you are doing that you believe have allowed you to follow in the footsteps and live the kind of dream, live in a world and in a society and a community that Brother King wanted. And just create that list. Well, I got a black friend. All right, that's good. You know, we got a brown friend. I invite all folks over to congregate and to hang out. You know, I do these things. I vote the right way. Because again, right, if you vote for something that's anti-black, then you're supporting black oppression. So create that list. Then once you've created that list, create a second list on the things you would like to do that you're not doing, the things that must happen in order to bring about a real radical transformation in our communities or within society. Because see, that's what King was talking about, right? That's what radical love is all about, that transformation. What can you do to transform your community, your workplace? What can you do to be much more radical like King? And if you struggle coming up with something, reach out to me. Reach out to Brother Carson, right? I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you about the ways we can do it. Because, see, I'm telling you, I'm already working with folks in this community on how to do that. And if you want to get in on this, if you really want to do the stuff that brings about the dream that Brother King's talking about, we can have this conversation. Happy MLK Day, folks. I hope you really will think about this, and I hope you'll take a deep, soulful look at yourself. Like I'm taking a deep, soulful look at myself too. Let me say, I'm a flawed human being, and I have things I got to fix and I got to work on. So I'm not just talking about you. I'm talking about me too, because I'm fully aware of my contradictions, my inconsistent patterns. I'm fully aware of things that I could be, I'm kind of mailing it in. I'm taking short steps. All right. I'm not taking those full steps forward that I need to. And I need to critique and evaluate myself if I want these things to happen. The things in which I sometimes think, oh, I don't think I can do this, when I know I probably could. I just need to find that extra space and that extra energy to do it. And those are the things I need to do. So I'd love for you to join me on this. Let's ponder. Let's celebrate. Let's think about the radical king, not the sanitize, not the deodorize, not the social media performative king that we exist in this world. Thanks for joining me on Race Matters, folks. Hope you have a good day. I'll see you next time.